Welcome to the Rideshare Guy Podcast, where you will learn about the rideshare and mobility industry straight from Harry Campbell, who's got over 5 years experience covering the industry and has talked to thousands of drivers. There's no better place to stay up to date, entertained, and educated. So let's dive in.
So today I'm talking with Ezra Goldman, the co-founder of Upshift, a fractional car club startup in San Francisco. They actually deliver you a hybrid RAV4 SUV or a Prius on the days you need to drive and then pick it up to gas, clean, and park it when you aren't using it. So pretty much everything you need. Ezra co-founded a dockless bike share in 1999, so he was way ahead of the curve. Helped design a shared folding electric scooter at the MIT Media Lab with Piaggio in 2006 while doing his master's in city planning. He's consulted on innovation for HP, was a managing director of a tech startup in Copenhagen, where he was also a PhD candidate studying why Danish people ride bicycles. And in addition, Ezra has given hundreds of rides as an Uber and Lyft driver to bootstrap Upshift while it was in its early days. So I think because of his experience as a driver, it's really informed how he now hires at Upshift, and I'm sure more with his company. So Ezra, I'm excited to chat. How are you doing today?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I think the first question I have to ask you is, well, what rating did you end up with those Uber and Lyft rides as a driver? How'd you end up? Were you a good driver, okay, or, on the edge?
I wasn't deplatformed by the company, so I guess I was above.
All right. So you were never deactivated as a driver?
No. I deactivated myself when I stopped driving, but I don't remember exactly what it was, but
Very
it's pretty
cool.
good.
Well, we're definitely going to get into your background with Uber and Lyft driving a little later in the podcast, but I kind of want to start at the beginning because you have a very interesting background, especially considering now that, I don't know how you'll describe it, but I think of you as running a car startup, but you kind of got your start with dockless bikes and all of that. So can you tell me a little bit about your background and kind of how you made that transition from, dockless bikes and scooters to cars?
Yeah, I think my real passion has always been about improving cities and making them more sustainable and more livable. And in order to do that, I think we need fewer cars, not more. In order to do that, I think ironically, we need to have more cars shared. And so that kind of was what got me into the position of getting into developing a new shared vehicle platform. And actually, the impetus came out of this when I was doing the PhD research at the University of Copenhagen, which is almost a decade ago at this point. And I was just looking at all the data that I could find around, if we get more people riding bikes, does that mean we have fewer cars on the street? Does that mean we have fewer vehicle miles traveled? And to some extent, that's true. But, the best data that I was seeing as I was looking around at all the different models and alternatives that were out there was actually coming from the car share space. And it kind of got me realizing that, if you really want to replace car ownership, you need to provide car access. Because there are certain kinds of trips that are just really difficult to make without a car. So you want to carry a bunch of groceries, you want to go a long distance, you want to carry a bunch of passengers, you want to go surfing. It's just certain kinds of trips that are very difficult to do. And I think you probably know this as an electric vehicle owner. It's kind of like the range anxiety that people have with electric vehicles, right? It's like, well, there's these 10% of trips that are just really hard to do unless I can go hundreds of miles. Even
though you may never even take those trips or maybe very infrequent.
And maybe those are very, exactly. And those don't have to be frequent. But as long as they're frequent enough in your mind, that can be enough to say, okay, I'm going to buy a gas car as opposed to an electric, right? And I think it's the same when we look at our transportation systems in cities, right? Because if you say we're going to replace car ownership with some sort of shared system, it's not like people are going to sell their cars and then just do Upshift. They're going to sell their cars in Upshift plus, bike share and ride share and scooter share and public transit and a whole bunch of other things. And that'll all be sort of wrapped up into one unified package. And right now, I think what we have is essentially range anxiety in our shared mobility fleets, where we don't actually have great solutions for certain kinds of trips. And so we have lots of last mile solutions, right? If you want to go like a mile down the road, man, you've got like 100 options right now. You could take a bus, you could take a ride share, you could take a scooter, you could take a bike share, you could have your own bike or scooter.
You can walk.
But as soon as you're like, you can walk. But as soon as you want to like take a car for the day, like could do
Yeah.
car share, but it's really expensive, inconvenient, and a lot of friction. You could do rental car, even more
Yeah.
expensive, even less convenient. What a lot of people end up doing, about a third of the population in a city like San Francisco is doing, is they're just owning a
Yeah.
car that just sits there 6 days out of 7, and they're moving it more to, avoid parking tickets and than they are to actually go
Yeah.
anywhere useful. And so that was really the impetus for me, was like looking at this going, wow, there's like 250,000 people in San Francisco who are driving their car like once or twice a week. And that's enough for them to say, I don't want to do car share because that doesn't work for me. And even despite all these different solutions, their best solution is still just own a car
Yeah.
and park it. And so that really got me thinking, well, how do we get rid of those cars? Because if you can, get rid of 250,000 cars in San Francisco, you could literally eliminate the need for all street parking in San Francisco.
Yeah. Well,
and that could be
yeah.
parklets, micro mobility lanes. I mean, literally anything but just parking a car there all day.
Well, that was going to be my next question, actually, because sort of from everything you're describing sounds great, but it doesn't seem like it would have a huge sort of reduction in congestion, but more the ability to get rid of on-street parking and, replace it with all those positive things you mentioned. Is that sort of how you see the, kind of main benefit of what Upshift can bring to the table in cities, or is it combined, mixed?
I think it's primarily a parking issue from a city standpoint. I think that's the biggest benefit. But I do think there is some data that shows, at least if you look at traditional car sharing services, there's a 27% reduction in vehicle miles traveled with those platforms, because you've made pricing variable. And as soon as you have to think even a little bit, I mean, we've kind of tried to split the difference where it's not like, okay, it's $100 to take this car for the day. But rather say, look, there's a fixed monthly cost. You get a certain amount of access credits to use the service, and then as you go, you kind of apply those credits to using the car. It does kind of decouple the sort of payment from the usage in a way that is differentiated, I think, from traditional pay-per-use models, which is fundamentally different from a psychological mentality model, and is more similar to a traditional lease. However, I think there is still sort of this. People definitely do get attached to those days that they have in their account, and they are valuable to them. They know how much they cost. And so I think that does kind of mean that people do more trip chaining. They're like, oh, I'm going to go do this, multiple errands together. They're not driving their car around the block just to look for street sweeping, to avoid street sweeping once or twice a week. And I think they are more efficient with their trips. They're probably also taking fewer trips that aren't really necessary. So I do think that it is having some reduction in miles traveled as well, probably similar to what you might see.
Yeah, that's fair. No, and I think it's interesting to think about. I think clearly the greater impact, or the huge impact it could make is on getting rid of on-street parking, and obviously replacing with anything but a car in front of people's houses or businesses.
Exactly.
Literally anything you put there will be better. But I think when it comes to
it's kind of mind blowing that the average cost of an apartment in San Francisco is like $3,000. And it costs about $11 to park your car in front of it.
I think I have to give a shout out to a former Rideshare Guy Podcast guest, Victor Pontus. I know he did this cool thing in San Francisco. He called it We Park, and basically they all would just go sit and work out of parking spaces, sort of to show the fact that exactly what you just highlighted right there, that it's ridiculous, before the pandemic, to rent a place in San Francisco, yet you could literally, go and get this hugely underpriced asset in a parking spot and, basically stake it out.
Well, I've actually thought about, creating some sort of mobile home type situation. And people kind of do this right now with like RVs and stuff in San Francisco. But, it makes a lot of sense, right? It's like you can't afford rent. You just buy a trailer and park it out front. And it's, as long as you do it once a week, you're totally legal.
Definitely. So I'm curious to know, why don't you give me what's the quick pitch for Upshift, or how do you describe it in sort of 60 seconds or less?
Sure. I mean, Upshift is essentially taking all the convenience and freedom that you get from owning a car and stripping away all the friction and headaches that would come with owning a car. So you subscribe based on how often you need to drive, and then whenever you need a car, we deliver you a hybrid RAV4 SUV or Prius right to your door. You can book via app, or you can just send us an SMS, and then it shows up at your door, clean, gassed, and with full coverage insurance. You drive it wherever you need to go for a few hours to a few days, and then when you're done, you just park it and walk away, and we'll come pick it up. So, we deal with all the maintenance. If there's a repair that needs to get done, we'll take it into the shop and get it fixed. So you really don't have to deal with anything other than just going where you need to go.
So this would be, if I'm a customer, I would think of this as sort of a daily rental, but also a membership club.
Yeah, I mean, you could think of it like a car club. It's kind of a fractional car club for the masses. So there's these like super car clubs, where you can get a Lamborghini or whatever. We've kind of taken that and said, okay, but how do we apply this to kind of a more mainstream audience? And I think really the other way to think about it is it's a fractional lease, right? And so right now we have essentially a bunch of solutions for people who drive less than 1,000 miles a year. In fact, car share members drive about 300 miles a year, so basically nothing. And then we have all these options for people driving 10, 15, 20,000 miles a year. And if you're the kind of person who, for example, the average Metro mile driver with a pay-as-you-go mileage-based insurance, they're driving 6,000 miles a year. Well, so what are they doing? Well, they're just buying cars and parking on the street and trying to get a used car and pay the leased insurance and street park it and do mileage-based, just try and reduce their costs as much as possible. But they still have to deal with all the headaches of like parking it and insuring it and maintaining it and all that. So it's kind of like, what's a 6,000 mile fractional lease? Like, what does that even look like? That's kind of what.
Yeah, no, I like that term fractional lease. I think it's something that most people are familiar with and kind of understand the concept that we're all going to go in on this shared asset. Like I'm going to use it some of the time, you're going to use it some of the time, but someone else is kind of responsible for all the the crappy parts of owning the car and managing it and operating it.
Yeah, it's funny. I kind of went into this. I never owned a car, and I never wanted to own a car, and now suddenly I own a bunch of cars. And so all the things I didn't want to deal with, which is why I didn't own a car in the first place, I'm now dealing with exponentially.
That's an interesting paradox, I guess you would say. Yeah. So
I've got from being a guy who doesn't even like cars to being someone who's like,
you're probably an expert now.
2021.
It's kind of funny.
All this cool new stuff on it.
Interesting. So, with that, you don't have to share everything, but I'm curious to know, can you give us a sense of where the business is at, I guess, physically? I think you guys are operating in San Francisco and, sort of what's the company look like? Do you have a number of, vehicles out there, customers, whatever numbers you want to share? And I think you've shared some in the past, so hopefully not asking to reveal all the secrets.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're kind of a small but growing membership. It's definitely a tight community of folks that we're building out here in San Francisco. And, a number of our members have been with us for years on end. We've had people been with us from the start, which is like 4.5 years at this point. So, we have really great relationships with our members, and we don't think of them as, just another number. I mean, I personally know all of them by name and communicate with them on a fairly regular basis. So it's definitely a very different experience, I think, in that regard than you might get with something else where, you just call some call center and you have no idea who you're going to get. We're here in San Francisco. Obviously, we'd love to be in markets all across the country. And we're, running this campaign on Republic right now to, fundraise more money so that we can grow in San Francisco as well as, nationally. We're aiming to, I think I actually just posted on Republic, plans to double our fleet in the next, basically by the spring, and then double it again by the end of the summer. And, we'll see where we're at that point, maybe double it again by the end of next year. But we're definitely looking at a pretty aggressive growth strategy. Cool.
So I have a couple questions about the Republic fundraising campaign, but before we get into that, what's it take to sort of, I guess you would say balance this marketplace? I don't know if you think of it as a marketplace, but I mean, do you need one car to serve 10 members or 20 members? Or, when you're talking about doubling your fleet, I'm curious to know, let's get into the nitty gritty. What are the numbers, or sort of what are some examples of what it takes to, keep your customers happy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a small number of members per car. So if you look at, say, a Zip car, for example, I think it's something 76 or 86 to 1, something in that order of magnitude. And I think the smallest kind of member to vehicle ratios I've seen with car share fleets are 40 to 1. So we're probably about 10x smaller than that in terms of members to vehicles. We're still working out the exact perfect member to vehicle ratio, but
in the single digits.
Like a number less than 10. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Well, because you think about, you've got people going 1 or 2 days a week. there's only so many days in a week. So, um, I think that's kind of what we found. And, as you kind of go down the direction of people driving less frequently, you can get more members per vehicle, but you end up with other friction points where it's like, well, those people are only driving, once a month. Right. Well, what day are they going to pick? They're going to pick the most popular day that everybody wants to drive. Now I have to set a bunch of restrictions on them. So
what are the most popular kind of times and days and places and types of trips that you found with your members?
I mean,
I guess I'm curious if you're running into that issue.
Getting out into nature on the weekends is definitely our biggest challenge, or our biggest use case, I would say, and also our biggest challenge in terms of managing availability. So, we are looking at, but actually, recently we've seen a lot of people midweek starting to use it more and more. As during the pandemic, there's new use cases that have been kind of interesting. So we've got a hairstylist who's, taking our car out pretty regularly now, like a couple days a week, even midweek, to go cut hair all around the Bay Area in people's backyards. We've got architects taking our cars out. We've got, what else? People going down to, universities or corporate campuses, once or twice a week, because they're not coming in every day, but they might still want to go in for a meeting here and there. So there are different kinds of use cases we've seen throughout the week. But definitely getting out into nature on the weekends is very popular, especially now during the pandemic. People just want to get out of the house and go. The only place you can really go is like the beach or the woods or something like that.
So it sounds like a lot of, for pleasure trips, for work trips, sort of the, academic, school type trip. And so I'm curious how you think and what? Shopping and errands. Okay, shopping and errands.
Basically all of our members at some point will, do a Trader Joe's run or something.
So how do you balance, sort of, especially with your background, and sort of focus on sustainability? I mean, I guess from us, if you had a purely sustainability, I guess focus, right, you would want to get as many people using the car as possible, right? And I guess on the business side, or if you're sort of trying, well, not necessarily trying to maximize income, but I guess how do you balance that, like with the, sort of, you want as many people in this car with also the best experience for your customers? Because I think one thing that's really unique about TNCs like Uber and Lyft is that they use this surge pricing, which sort of seems very counterintuitive. Like, wow, this, is a terrible experience for the customer because they now have to pay more for the exact same trip. But what's so impressive and so amazing about it is it incentivizes drivers like yourself back in the day, and me when I'm driving for Uber and Lyft, to actually go hit the road at times where where I otherwise wouldn't be. So it increases that supply, during peak times, basically, right? And I think the metric that they care about is availability, right? They always want to see a car available if you're a customer. So how do you think about that with Upshift?
It's the same. I mean, basically, if you're doing any kind of transportation service, it comes down to convenience and reliability. It's like, can I get to where I need to go every time I want to go there? And how easy is it for me to get access to that transportation solution and get from A to B to do the thing I need to do? And then, is it safe? Can I afford it? And is it sort of a little squishier part is, is it sort of like culturally acceptable, right? Like if all my friends think it's, stupid to ride a bike, it's a lot harder for me to ride a bike. But if all my friends are riding a bike from bar to bar and I'm the one guy who's like, half an hour late to show up for my drink, like, then I'm the jerk, and sort of vice versa. So I think that's another piece of it. But, fundamentally, the biggest thing with any transportation is like, what's the fastest way for me to be most convenient? And you make it, if you just reduce friction. And when it comes to the pricing, I mean, that is something that we've had challenges with because we don't have surge pricing right now. It's just a flat day rate. Essentially, you just get a day credit, and whichever car you take on whatever day, it's the same price essentially. Obviously, that does lead to more bunching, where it's like people want the best car on the best day, and they want that every time, right? So that does create an issue. So we've been looking into different ways to address that, and I don't want to get into the point where I'm charging people every time they take the car out and say, okay, well, it's $10 more to take it out this day or that day. Because I think that we really want it to look and feel like car ownership. And if I own a car, even if I only drive it every weekend, like, it's my car, I do whatever I want. Like, I'm not thinking about every trip I take as having a cost. I just know what it's just, I take the car out. There's essentially, you could argue there's zero cost to driving right? Like, I pay for insurance and I pay for my car payment and I pay for my parking garage maybe, and I pay for a damage here and there and gas and what. But if I just get in my car and I drive from here to Palo Alto,
costs you nothing,
and I drive back again, like
in that moment,
it costs me nothing. In that moment, I do not pull out my wallet and make a single payment unless I just happen to cross a bridge that has a toll or park in a garage or I have to top up my gas. But it's very disconnected, and so I think we want to kind of maintain that sort of illusion of sorts, or that psychology around there is a cost here, but it's kind of a known certain quantity, and people really like just saying, okay, it's $100 a month. I know what it is. I know what I'm going to get. And so we've been looking into like a points-based system where you say, okay, we'll give you 1,000 points or whatever, and it's 50 points on this day and 30 points on that day, which would definitely address the availability issue and also make it kind of more aligned with trying to distribute the demand throughout the week and things like that. But we have had some concerns around, like, does that make it more confusing? Like, does that it just complicates the model, and we're all about simplicity, so we've been hesitant about that. But I do think that there will be some changes like that.
I like that North Star that you mentioned. Sort of, you want it to feel as much like car ownership as possible, but not actually owning the car. And I think that's a key distinction, because really the example you mentioned was perfect, right? Like when you want to go for basically any trip, hour or less, right, to go see a friend or family, it doesn't cost you anything in that moment. So how can you come as close as possible to that? And I mean, adding, I think points is better than cash, but it is, like you said, it does add a little bit of complexity. And I imagine, I feel like I've seen this in the WeWork that I used to rent, right? I mean, certain meeting rooms were a little bit more points per hour during certain times, and I don't know what the best solution is, but I would be curious to see what you guys come up with. And I don't know, maybe if there's other models that you've looked at in other transportation or logistics businesses that could kind of give you some insight.
Yeah, I mean, we've looked at all the other fractional services, right? So you've got fractional jets and yachts and homes and super cars and things like that. And a lot of them do, either have kind of some kind of per use fee, but maybe half of what you would otherwise pay on a comparable, rental kind of solution, with some kind of like monthly fee on top of that that's fixed, or they'll do points. And a lot of I think most, if not all, the car clubs actually do points. So that's probably the most realistic option, is to just say, okay, you have a monthly fee. There's some activation fee, a monthly fee, and then, you buy points kind of as needed. And then, the more points you buy, the cheaper they get maybe. And then, there's different points for different cars at different times. And I think, the best you could really do is you just have to say, okay, well, there's 2 cars and there's 2 or 3 different kinds of time periods, right? There's peak and off peak, at least, and maybe like a holiday super premium kind of thing. And, you just say there's 4, maybe 6 different price points, and they're just fixed. Because I think as soon as you start going into like surge pricing, where it's like, well, this weekend it was sunny, and so it's like 2x, like that starts to feel a lot. Then I really have no idea. Like I just get on the platform, I just car, like I have no idea what I'm going to pay, and like now I have this uncertainty, and I think that one of the things that was a big friction point for me when I was doing car share was like, well, okay, I have my thing I want to do. I want to go for a hike for a few hours. Well, what's it going to cost? That's like the one thing. It's like, it's got to be $8 an hour or $13 an hour. Well, this depends on what car happens to be available and whatever the algorithm decides. And I'm like, okay, so is my hike going to be like $40 or $70? Like, I don't know. And so I think that uncertainty creates a lot of friction. And it does have I think it works when it's sort of a taxi or rental car alternative. But I think when you're trying to get into a ownership alternative, I think it really moves away from that. So it's something we'd have to be cautious.
Interesting. Well, it's definitely a little, you have to navigate this problem carefully, but switch gears a little bit. I want to go back to, you mentioned that you were raising money on Republic. So it sounds like the company Upshift has been around for a while, operating in SF. And it sounds like at some point or another, you got it in your head that you wanted to bring this, expand in San Francisco, go nationwide. How did that process or sort of thinking go? Because I know we've got a lot of startup folk and entrepreneurs that listen too. And then I'm curious to know kind of what what your experience was like on raising money on Republic, because I'm looking at your page right now, and we'll leave a link in the show notes, but it looks pretty good to be, raised $549,000 in 55 and almost 2,600 investors. So that seems pretty cool. Seems like a success to me. I'm curious to hear your experience and take.
It's been fantastic. Yeah, no, I got great things to say for it. I mean, it's certainly been a bit of a godsend now, especially during the pandemic. Where it's the whole venture capital world has been kind of turned on its head, and it's definitely not typical VC funding rounds getting made right now. So it's been great to have this kind of just run in the background and essentially automate our fundraise. And like you said, I mean, over $500,000 raised is certainly by any metric successful outcome. So we've been very pleased. We've raised around $2 million at this point in total, about half debt, half equity. About half of the equity has now come from the Republic campaign. But obviously we have a bunch of cars too, so we've also had to do sort of a parallel debt financing. It's almost like we're building two companies in one. We have this kind of like almost rental car like, debt financed business that operates more or less similar to, a mom and pop startup rental car company. And is unfortunately treated as such by most finance companies. And we have this sort of like, this will be the next Uber, like, VC opportunity on the software side. And, it's definitely an interesting challenge to figure out how to kind of do both of those things at once. And, we're certainly also interested always in new kinds of, creative solutions on the debt financing side, which I know a lot of companies do a bunch of different things that are not traditional financing. Yeah,
because I mean, obviously these cars, a Prius, I'm assuming is $30,000 to $40,000, and you guys are not buying 25. Okay, 25, you're buying them, and you don't need to, I guess you can finance them, but that's sort of separate. It sounds like that's kind of separate from any, fundraising or anything like that you're doing. So you've got how many cars do you have in San Francisco?
I'm not going to disclose any exact numbers, but we have a small fleet of Priuses and RAVs in San Francisco that, like I said, we're expanding rapidly. But it is definitely a very different company. You're basically looking at people who are looking for 5, 10, 15% returns on their investment, sort of on the, they just want to get their car payment and then a little bit on top for the risk, and they're not really interested in a 10x return. And then you have sort of the software VCs who are like, I'm not interested in a 7% return on my investment. Like I need like a 10x return on my investment. So I think they're kind of fundamentally like two very different animals, and I think we're treating them as such, and they kind of grow in parallel with one another, but they're almost like separate companies.
Yeah. Do you think there was any one thing that led to your success raising money on Republic? Because I imagine that there are a lot of companies on Republic that haven't raised $500,000. So curious what your secret sauce was.
I don't know. Have a good idea. I mean, I don't think we had a ton of success on the sort of growth marketing side. I mean, we ran some Facebook ads and things like that, but it was, it's mostly organic on there. And so, I don't know. I mean, we've seen sort of ebbs and flows with things that are sometimes unrelated, right? Like, Republic launched an iOS app yesterday, and we saw a big boost that had nothing to do with anything we were doing, but they had just done this big marketing push on their side, and so that just sort of happened to bring in more funds for everybody, including us. I don't have any great advice. I mean, if you have some people who can kind of help you get the first seed money in there, that definitely helps. You have friends and family who can put in, 5, 10, 25K. I mean, not individually necessarily, but if you could get
zero to at least something.
A bunch of people together, at least, because once you basically hit the first 25,000, that's when they like put you on the website and they really kind of promote you. And we got a big boost after they promoted us to their investor base, which is like a few 100,000 people. So that definitely kind of kickstarted it. So that's really critical. And then if you have like larger investors who could put in $25,000 or even larger checks, like at sort of key points in your campaign where you're like, all right, I get to the first 100 or 200,000, and then I get this like, you know, known investor to put in like some meaningful check, like, and also kind of help you to get a little lift and momentum. I've heard that be helpful for
that's
people.
a good idea. It's cool.
And then of course podcast.
Yeah, no, it's a cool model, and that's where I think definitely, hopefully, we'll get you some investors out of this podcast right now. But appreciate you sharing that. The last thing that I want to touch on with you, and you mentioned in your bio that you drove for Uber and Lyft while you were bootstrapping Upshift. I thought that was very cool. You know, we've had actually several startup founders on the podcast now who kind of either got their idea. I'm thinking back to Herb Coakley, who did Maestro, and he got his idea for his startup while he was driving, raised money from one of his passengers, which was kind of cool. Now to, so I'm curious, did you learn anything from your time as a driver that informed either the business model at Shift, or I'm assuming had some impact on the workers that you're hiring on the concierges?
Yeah, no, I would say that probably the biggest thing was just really getting a very hardened sense of how important it is to treat everybody on the team with dignity and respect, and really make them, you know, I know in the last few years there's been all this kind of push towards sort of the gig economy and Prop 22 and all these kinds of changes that have happened recently. But you know what I was finding being on the platform and driving for these companies was that I didn't feel like I was really being treated as sort of on par with the sort of folks at HQ,
corporate,
right? Like all the engineers and people making six-figure salaries, corporate, you know, they're all doing really well and have, you know, foosball tables and, you know, amazing healthcare plans and, you know, all these great benefits. And meanwhile, you know, as you're sitting there out there literally risking your life every day, like hoping you don't like run anybody over or like get in an accident or get some crazy guy in the back who's going to like, you know, pull a gun on you or something. You know, you're out there making, you know, sometimes $5 an hour, you know, and, you know, I just felt like that was really not terribly fair. And so the way that we've been building it is to say, look, we're going to provide the car. I mean, you provide a bicycle, but we actually pay for maintenance on your bicycle for the time that you drive with us. We provide the car, so you don't have to provide your own vehicle, which is a big expense if you're driving on Uber. We pay a starting salary of $20 an hour.
And just to be clear, these are the concierges like, on your team that deliver the cars to people?
These are the concierge. Correct. Yeah, these are the people who are doing deliveries. So our starting salary is $20 an hour. We have offered even hazard pay during, you know, 20% hazard pay during the pandemic. You know, we hire people as W-2s, and you know, we don't do contractors, and we even have you know, one concierge has been with us for 3 years now and has equity in the company, and you know, is involved in decisions around you know, technology and product designs, especially around stuff that impacts the concierge role itself. You know, and so I see, like, as Upshift grows, like I would love to have those people like sit in on board meetings and stuff, because like I just think that there's a huge value that they bring to the table, and they're not sort of a quote unquote essential or expendable workers. You know, these are really core teammates that have a lot to offer the company, and you know, and I think that, you know, I've personally done probably thousands of deliveries myself. You know, so. I know exactly what it takes to get out there and, you know, bike up a big hill and, you know, in the rain and deal with stuff that's not necessarily pleasant to deal with. You know, jumping cars on a busy street or whatever, like random stuff comes your way with managing a fleet. Like there's just a lot of challenges to deal with, right? And so I think that there's a huge amount of opportunity there, honestly, to build relationships with them as really core value teammates. And I think one of the other big issues that I saw with Uber and Lyft and really with all the kind of gig companies, there tends to be kind of a unequal. You asked me earlier about the you know, my rating, and I can't remember what my rating was, but I do remember that my rating, and I can't remember what the threshold was at that point or what it is now, but you know, it was something like I had to have 4.6
above
stars
4.6
or whatever, or they would boot me off the platform. 4.6, right? So if you have below 4.6, you're off the platform, right? And it doesn't take a lot of 4-star reviews even before you're kicked off, and so that's obviously a big challenge. But then I would get matched with riders that were like, I don't know what I think their threshold's like 4.1.
I think there's no threshold for riders.
Or is there no, not at all? Like I would get, these like super entitled jerks who would like sit in the back. I had one guy, I was parked at a stoplight, and he literally made this little, like kind of like he was saying "giddy up" to a horse.
Yeah, that's like a little the lights
disrespectful,
to say the least.
Dumped him out the side of the road in the middle of like sketchy neighborhood, because I was like, dude, I don't know, this isn't. But that's totally fine, right? Like there's almost nothing you can do as a paying customer to get booted off the platform, right? And so one of the things that we made a real point of is to say, look, if you're an entitled guy who's going to just like, park in a red zone every time you return the car in front of a fire hydrant, like, you're out. Like, you don't need to deal with that. Like, it's just, like there's every, our concierge are hardworking people too. And, they deserve to be treated with respect. And like, we're not going to have a different playing field for our members as our concierge. And so as a result, we have a really fantastic group of members who treat our concierge super well. And I always get reports from the field from our concierge that they love our members and vice versa. And so I think that just creates a very different service that, is much better attention on both sides.
No, I was really excited to discuss this with you because I think that I kind of often joke, if you ask drivers, if you let drivers set their own rates, they'd kind of like price themselves out of the market, right? Like you can't give any one cohort, I think, like full control and like give them everything that they want because, they sort of obviously have their own personal interests, but you've sort of done that. And then now you're on the
well, if they were really contractors and independent business owners, they could set whatever rate they want.
That's true. Well, that's another that's a discussion for another podcast. But now you're sort of on the other opposite end of the coin, and sort of running the business. But you've done, you've been in the trenches and you built it up, so you kind of very acutely understand. And I like what you said: treat everyone the same from the top to bottom, because I feel like with a lot of tech companies today, there's sort of like these two class of workers. The frontline workers who are, okay, let's say they're independent contractors, or even if they're at a company like Amazon or others that do hire people as employees. But it seems like it's pretty obvious that there's two classes of workers, like the corporate white collar and the sort of frontline blue collar. And I think that what I've noticed actually is that like if you treat the blue collar or the frontline workers like shit, there's really nothing preventing management from eventually at some point or in some instance also treating like those white collar workers. And I think we've seen like some pretty good evidence of that with Uber, for example, right? Like there's been numerous, sort of whether it was like layoffs that were done in, like a very shady type way, or, issues at the company, like with sexual harassment and all that. And like, I guess when I saw those stories, it just like wasn't that surprising to me. Cause if they would like, a driver who has 25,000 trips who, gets deactivated because of one, passenger complaint without being able to investigate or without being able to, sort of like make your case heard. Like I've seen that happen many times. Like if they would let that happen with anyone or with one class of workers, they would let it happen with the other class, right? What do you think?
Well, best believe that everything that just happened with Prop 22 isn't also going to filter its way back to the white collar. It's just a new kind of precariat that they can create that says, well, I'm going to hire you, but not they're already doing point, good contractors example. At, Google, Apple, and other big tech companies where they have kind of contractors and consultants who they don't have to pay benefits, they don't have to provide these things. And then they kind of reserve the employee status with benefits for only the sort of very top tier echelon of employees. And I think there's no reason to believe that this third category of sort of not quite contractors and not quite employees, contractors with benefits or whatever it is, doesn't also end up being applied to designers and engineers and all the other white collar jobs. Completely.
Yeah, actually, I haven't thought about that, but
and that's when people will say, "Hey, that's not cool." But it's unfortunate that it's going to take that before people really start to complain about it. But I do think that that's likely to happen. So the last
very quick exercise that I want to do with you, I'm always really just thinking about the best way to sort of connect, because I mean, like, I don't think you're ever going to be able to treat, with a business like Uber or a business where you have like Amazon, right, where you are going to always have, more of the knowledge workers and more of the frontline workers. Like, I don't think you necessarily, that's a bad thing, but I do think that it's important to sort of like treat everyone with the same amount of respect. You can't pay, the CEO the same as the frontline person who's, making corrugated boxes on the front line. But I do, I was taking notes while you were talking, and I hear a few of the things that I thought were important, and I'm just curious if you have anything to add, and we'll end after that. But I like the concept of doing it yourself. So everyone, if you're in management or whatever, like you at some point need to go into the front lines and do that job. So you can obviously empathize with that. I also like this concept of everyone being an owner, even if it's psychologically, like even if you only have one share of the company, you have something. Like that's better than nothing. And these are all notes from when you're talking. So this was you, not me. You also talked about upward mobility, hiring people from the front lines all the way up into, the corporate side or management, two-way accountability, like don't let customers treat your frontline workers like crap and vice versa. So those were sort of the four things I noted. Is there anything else I'm missing, or what do you think?
Well, I think those are all definitely great points. I mean, upward mobility. One of our advisors, for example, started out at Hertz, just at the front desk, just doing very low level stuff, and then became like the very senior position there, and now he's VP operations at different companies that he's been working at. VP operations of Equinox and other big companies. So, I do think that there are opportunities for people to kind of prove themselves and work their way up if you give them that. And I think the other big inspiration for us is really Dan Price, with Gravity Payments. I don't know if you know the story there, but he's been really influential for us in he cut his own salary as the big boss CEO to make sure that everybody on his company could get $70,000 minimum wage. And I think in this era where everybody kind of has this sense of like, oh well, the CEO should get 400 times the the lowest paid worker or whatever, and they should only get sort of barely enough to survive and live on food stamps to just kind of make rent. Like, I just don't think that's regardless, kind of the bottom line. Like, I just don't think that's ethically very good, and I think it's bad for society. Like if you look at Japan, for example, it's probably changing now, perhaps, but the CEOs there, like and I used to live in Denmark, and I would work at Lars von Trier's film studio. He's a fairly well-known director. And you'd go in there at lunchtime, and there'd be like a canteen, and Lars von Trier would be sitting there in a fleece like next to you eating lunch with like it's just like they don't have like this sort of private jet mentality that we have here, where it's like these people are untouchable and they're just like godhead figures. It's like they're just everyday people like everybody else, and they make more money, but they don't
act
make
like it
400 times or 1,000 times, or it's just like how much is really enough to kind of justify the difference in value that's being added, it's like there's been some analysis that shows that Jeff Bezos has made he could pay all his workers over $100,000 and still have as much money as he had before the pandemic hit. Like, is that necessary to like have anybody be that wealthy? Like, no. So I think it's kind of like the question of like how much is really enough to say, look, yes, there's going to be some differential in how much you pay your engineers versus like your frontline workers, but how much exactly, and is that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important question to sort of ask yourself as a CEO, and I think I like that way of looking at it. Like, obviously, more and more money, oftentimes to people seems great, but I think that if you get to a point where enough is enough for you, then maybe that's the time where you can kind of increase, everyone else. So I think that's a good note to end it on. And I did think of one other thing: a diverse team. I think especially with Uber and Lyft drivers, I know for sure that like even I'm running an English written blog and YouTube and podcast, and I'm not reaching a lot of people. So it's sometimes you gotta, get those perspectives for sure too.
Yeah, no, I think it definitely adds a ton of value, to not have everybody look like me. I mean, I've been pretty proud about the fact that
we say this like two white guys talking right now. So
Yeah, exactly. It's two white guys talking. But that's definitely super important to us to make sure that we're not doing things that are I think if you've gotten to the point where you're
Yeah.
huge, and then you hire some like, head of diversity or whatever, like you've kind of lost at that point.
Yeah.
Like because then now you're just like admitting
Yeah.
defeat. You're like, oh, how do I like fix the problem? As opposed to saying, look, how do you build a team and a structure that is actually welcoming
Yeah.
to everybody to come and join and support and really bring their
Yeah.
whole selves to work, as opposed to trying to kind of like
That's
backtrack and like tick
Yeah.
some boxes.
That's
like,
actually very
years
good point.
later.
I think that your early company culture really it's sort of like an oil tanker, right? Once it gets going 10, 20, 30, 40 knots, it takes a
Yeah.
long time to turn it, to steer it, and especially to do a 180.
Exactly.
So it is very important to
Exactly.
get that all buttoned down at the start. So really appreciate you coming on today, Ezra, and we're going to leave a link to upshiftcars.com. We'll leave a link to the Republic crowdfunding. I see I'm on that page right now, so I know it's republic.co/upshift. And I know you're on Twitter too. Do you want people to find you on Twitter, or where can they get a hold of you, or where should they go for more info on
Sure.
Upshift?
If they like, yeah, our handle across the internet is typically at
Cool.
Upshift Cars. You can also email me at ezra@upshiftcars.com, and my Twitter is at Ezra
Very
Goldman.
cool. Well, really appreciate you coming on, Ezra, and I'm waiting for you guys to expand to LA, because this sounds like a service I could definitely use myself. Take care.